Hey folks, welcome back to Indaba Africa. This is Chris coming to you from central Pennsylvania. And today's topic is Zimbabwe, where a strange situation developed today, July 29th, 2020, when the government of Zimbabwe announced a $3.5 billion compensation package for dispossessed commercial white farmers in the country. This has gotten the world's attention, and let's talk about that compensation package, the impact of it, and what the prospects are for Zimbabwe going forward. So today, President Emmerson Mnangagwa's ZANU-PF government announced a $3.5 billion US dollar deal to compensate between 3,500 and 4,500 commercial white farmers who were unlawfully dispossessed of their legally purchased land, beginning in a violent campaign which led to the deaths of dozens of farmers, their spouses, and hundreds of black farm workers beginning in April of 2000, over 20 years ago. Now, President Mnangagwa had the following to say today in announcing this deal. He said that the agreement was historic in many respects. It brings closure and a new beginning in the history of the land discourse in Zimbabwe. The process which has brought us to this event is equally historic as the reaffirmation of the irreversibility of land as well as a symbol of our commitment to constitutionalism, the respect for the rule of law, and property rights. Now, no doubt, Mnangagwa is pleased with the agreement and hopes it will end ZANU-PF's pariah status in the civilized world. Finance Minister Mutule Ncube had the following to say about the agreement. In the agreement, we have given ourselves 12 months to run around the world, around Zimbabwe, to think of ways of raising this funding. We are determined that we will achieve that. It is also about pledges, not necessarily about cash being put on the table. It's about commitment. So already one has to begin to question the genuine earnestness of ZANU-PF's deal. As their finance minister said, it's not about paying people, it's about the commitment. It's about the promise, ladies and gentlemen. Let's talk about that. Well, the now eviscerated Commercial Farmers Union, which was representing nearly all commercial farmers back in 2000 when this nonsense started, sees the agreement as bringing relief to members who've been driven off the land. And let me address that from the head of the Commercial Farmers Union. That's the President Andrew Pascoe, who had the following to say. After almost 20 years of conflict over the land issue, representatives of farmers who lost their land through the fast-track reform program and representatives of government have been able to come together to see a resolution of this conflict. To me, this is nothing short of a miracle. While I appreciate his sentiment, I'm not nearly as optimistic. While I would hope that commercial farmers and their descendants, as over 600 of these commercial farmers have now passed away, either through violent murders or through the passage of time, over 600 members have passed away. Either they or their descendants, those surviving or the descendants, receive compensation. I would hope that, in fact, it does happen. So what's going on here, ladies and gentlemen? Why now, after 20 years of ZANU-PF state-sponsored terrorism successfully depriving thousands of law-abiding Zimbabweans of their legally obtained property, and many of them even of their lives, not to mention the lives of hundreds of black farm workers and over 500,000 farm jobs that disappeared as a consequence of this violent seizure? Why now? No doubt the Commercial Farmers Union is hoping to at least get some measure of compensation for thousands of families who live in destitution, deprived of dignity and livelihoods for the crime of being loyal to Zimbabwe and remaining in the country after the end of the Rhodesian era, but lacking sufficient skin pigmentation to satisfy the racist regime of Robert Gabriel Mugabe. What is Mnangagwa up to? Well, the crocodile no doubt hopes that this deal will reassure investors who Harare is desperate to get back into the country, and also to convince skeptics that ZANU-PF respects the Constitution. Now that's a stretch, but we can all hope, can we not, Emmerson Mnangagwa? You see, in 2013, Mugabe's government amended the Constitution to require compensation for land expropriation, 13 years after it began sponsoring the theft of land and then outright just taking it itself. And it's now been 7 years since that law was promulgated. There was an attempt to start compensation in 2019, but very little came of it. And now this huge announcement today, as Zimbabwe is virtually on its knees, people starving around the country under the lockdown measures, which now require a curfew for anyone who doesn't have formal employment. You cannot leave your home. If you do have a job, you have a 12-hour curfew, so you must get back home before dark and can't go out until after sunrise. The economy is virtually collapsed. Who knows what the actual unemployment rate is in Zimbabwe? Anywhere from 70 to 90%. Who knows the actual figures? But the compensation is limited to farm improvements, as the government refuses to pay for stolen land, the land that it sponsored theft or it stole itself. Now, Mnangagwa had something further to say, specifically about that compensation. With regards to the land compensation agreement signed today, my administration reaffirms that the government of Zimbabwe does not have any obligation for compensation for acquired land. The Constitution bids us to compensate all the improvements on land. So the point here is a racial point, and it's a distortion of history, and it's an outright lie. The government of Zimbabwe refuses to compensate farmers for land that it stole from the farmers on the basis that they weren't legitimate owners. But the problem, of course, with that is that many of these farmers purchased the land under majority rule in Zimbabwe, and you could only buy land with the approval of the government. So in other words, Mugabe's government, as prime minister from 1980 to 1988, and then as president from 1988 until 2017, had first right of refusal on all property sales. So you couldn't buy farmland in Zimbabwe unless the government approved it. A majority government led by Robert Gabriel Mugabe and ZANU, and later ZANU-PF after the destruction of ZAPU. So give me a couple examples here to talk about that. First off, we have Mike Campbell. Mike Campbell bought his farm in 1980 under majority rule, and with his son-in-law Ben Vreeth, grew mangoes, citrus fruit, maize, tobacco, and sunflowers. The farm employed 500 people and was prosperous for 20 years until the farm invasions began. In November of 2008, after struggles to keep the farm and to take the government of Zimbabwe to the SADC Tribunal, the Southern African Development Communities Tribunal, in which they won a historic case against Mugabe and the government, Mike Campbell, 75-year-old Mike Campbell, his wife Angela, and his son-in-law Ben Vreeth were all kidnapped by Mugabe's forces and tortured for 9 hours. Sadly, Mike Campbell never fully recovered from that assault and died just a few years later at the age of 78 prematurely. Dave Wakefield is another example of a Zimbabwean commercial white farmer who lived by the rules and followed the law and purchased his land after majority rule in 1980. He owned the Chattersley Estate, which was a 2,000-hectare property. Bought it in 1980 from the government after he'd been relocated from land that his family had farmed for generations. Now, perhaps that land was in question as to the original provenance of it, but the land that he got in 1980 is land he bought, and he bought that with the settlement he got for the land taken from him, as well as borrowing money from a bank. Yet his land was stolen from him. The Commercial Farmers Union of Zimbabwe estimates that the actual compensation due to the farmers for their improvements, for their property, for the land itself is $9 billion US. So this figure falls far short of that. But of course, as I said, the government of Zimbabwe claims that it will not pay for the land because it's not under any obligation to do that. You see, it's perfectly okay to steal from people if they have the wrong skin color in Zimbabwe, regardless of the fact that they purchased the land legally with the government's approval, a government that had first right of refusal. And this is the story that ZANU-PF continues to obfuscate and hide behind opaque screens even to this day to lie about the provenance of land in Zimbabwe. Now, Mr. Wakefield last year in 2019 was offered $20,000 US as partial compensation. Now, he lost at least $2 million US in the theft of his farm, all the improvements and equipment. Interesting. See, there's one significant problem with all this, though, and that's that Zimbabwe's bankrupt, ladies and gentlemen. There's no money to pay victims. And the issue here is that where are they going to get the money? Well, the plan is to attract foreign donors, in other words, to sucker people from around the world into paying for ZANU-PF's crimes, to compensate the victims of its crimes, and to issue long-term bonds to finance the payouts. The credit worthiness of the government of Zimbabwe is, without question, non-existent. So who would be foolish enough to buy these long-term bonds is an open-ended question. So to me, this symbolizes a symbolic act, one which I don't genuinely see much in the way of compensation coming to the victims in Zimbabwe. Those alive, that is. Economist John Robertson had the following to say about the actual funding for this deal. The money is not yet available, he said. Even though they signed an agreement, it doesn't mean the money is now going to be distributed. Now that they've signed an agreement, they're going to use that agreement, no doubt. They're going to use that signature as a way to raise the money. Well, good luck with that. What does Zimbabwe have to offer anyone? What do they have to offer? I don't know really what they have to offer to attract foreign governments to donate money to compensate farmers who were defrauded and dispossessed by the government itself, the very government asking for the money. And who's going to buy these long-term bonds? So to me, this is just a symbolic act. Now, Emmerson Mnangagwa will be disappointed if he genuinely believes this deal will return ZANU-PF to legitimacy in international eyes. You see, Harari's missing the point entirely, ladies and gentlemen. This deal is not going to change things with the West. This was never simply about land theft. That's not when the so-called fictional sanctions were imposed against Mugabe and 178 officials in ZANU-PF and state-owned enterprises. No, those travel restrictions and financial controls against people who violated human rights and abrogated the rule of law, not against Zimbabwe, folks, never against Zimbabwe. The so-called international sanctions against Zimbabwe are not going to be lifted because they made a promise to provide compensation that does not exist to farmers. Because it wasn't about the theft of the farmland. It should have been from the outset, but the governments in Washington and in London and other locations were slow to act. They didn't impose sanctions in 2000. These restrictions didn't come until 2003. Nearly 3 years after, dozens of commercial farmers had been murdered, hundreds of black farm workers murdered on the farms. People like David Stevens, 47 years old. Martin Olds, 44 years old. It wasn't about the farms. So Mnangagwa is going to be bitterly disappointed if he thinks this is going to restore legitimacy and bring foreign direct investment into Zimbabwe. It's simply not the case. This has all along been about human rights abuses by the government of Zimbabwe and in particular its security forces. That's what the restrictions have been about. It's been about the abrogation of the rule of law, the theft of elections, the intimidation of political opponents, the assassination of judges and political opponents. And additionally, the compensation does not include land, which was lawfully obtained and purchased under majority rule, basically denying Zimbabweans their dignity and human rights on the basis of skin color. Nor does it bring back to life those murdered by ZANU-PF-backed thugs, David Stevens, Martin Olds, Mike Campbell, who never recovered from his brutal torture at the age of 75, Julius Ondoche, are gone forever, and we are all less as a consequence of their premature passing, ladies and gentlemen. If ZANU-PF wants to return to the Club of Nations, to the civilized world, ZANU-PF has to accomplish a few things before governments in the West lift these restrictions that prevent the likes of Emmerson Mnangagwa and Constantine Chiwengo from visiting Harrods or shopping in New York or traveling to luxury destinations around the world or using banking facilities in those places. ZANU-PF will need to become transparent and not be opaque. It will need to end human rights abuses by the security services, respect the rule of law, hold legitimate elections, stop harassment of political opposition figures, and here's my personal requirement, which these governments won't require of Zimbabwe, but I would require this. I require acknowledgement for ZANU-PF's land grab that it was racist, an act premised on an illegitimate claim. It meant that 42% of all commercial farmland had been legally purchased with Mugabe government's approval after majority rule in 1980, and it was not stolen by pioneer columns in the 1890s as the fictional myth that Robert Mugabe has perpetuated for near 30 years, talking about things that simply are not true. Yes, there is land in Zimbabwe that remained in the hands of white Zimbabweans whose ancestors had arrived in the 1890s, the 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, and got that land. And yes, some of that was taken by conquest, absolutely. But from 1980 until 2000, 20 years of majority rule, all under ZANU-PF, originally ZANU, but then after they destroyed ZAPU, merged it to create ZANU-PF. Under ZANU and ZANU-PF for 20 years, 42% of all land designated as commercial farmland had been sold at least one time. Some of that farmland had been sold on more than one occasion. And every sale, every single sale, including the land purchased by Mike Campbell and by Dave Wakefield, was done with the permission of Mugabe's government. There was no theft. There was no swindling going on here. These people borrowed money and worked the land. and made it function and made Zimbabwe's economy soar. And this is the deal. So what's the ultimate situation here? What's really going on? At the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, Emerson Mnangagwa and ZANU-PF are desperate. They pretend to fulfill the Constitution 7 years late. 7 years after the Constitution was amended, they now talk about compensation. And to be fair, they were talking, last year, so 6 years. But here we are 7 years into it. They lack the 3.5 billion US dollars. It doesn't exist. So where are they going to get it? They're going to beg for foreign countries to donate the money to compensate Zimbabweans who were damaged by the actions of Harare and ZANU-PF. Now, who's going to sign up for that? The Chinese? I don't think so. London? I don't think so. London gave 63 million pounds from 1980 to 1993 to purchase land. And where did it go? In the hands of Constantine Chiwenga, Sharon Speary, Robert Mugabe, and a whole host of senior ZANU-PF cadres, but not to small-scale black farmers or war veterans. So UK is not going to pay. The United States is certainly not going to pay. The International Monetary Fund is not going to give money. The World Bank is not going to give money. Who does that leave? The Chinese? The Chinese aren't going to pay for ZANU-PF's transgressions. They don't care about a handful of white commercial farmers or restoring a reputation of Zimbabwe in the civilized world. And where does that leave us? This is an ephemeral paper deal, which unfortunately some people are going to attach a great deal of hope to and think that they're actually going to get compensated. I would hope that they do, but I wouldn't hold my breath, folks. You'll just turn blue. Well, that's kind of the situation in this rather interesting development that's come out today, July 29th, 2020, about the government of ZANU-PF offering to compensate people whom it defrauded and stole from beginning 20 years ago. Law-abiding citizens who follow the rules in a majority-ruled Zimbabwe, folks. But unfortunately for them, they had the wrong skin pigmentation. So if you found this video thought-provoking or interesting, or just found it something worth listening to, and you're not a subscriber to my channel, I ask that you subscribe to the channel by smashing that subscription button right down there. Be sure to toggle that bell icon to get notified of updates whenever I do live streams or special feature streams or these prepared videos. If you got a comment or two you'd like to leave, feel free to leave the comments below. I ask that people not be abusive because I'm going to delete those. There's no need for trolls to show up. If you've got a legitimate point to make it, whether it's in support or in conflict with the comments I've made here. And finally, I ask that you smash that like button, folks, because the more likes as a percentage of views of this video, the more likely it is to be recommended to other folks interested in what's going on in Zimbabwe and Southern Africa. And with that, I thank you for your time. God bless. See you here next time on Indaba Africa.